Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Lessons from the Leaders. My name is Victoria Weeks and I'm privileged to be the chair of the Australian Gender Equality Council. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. Though we may be physically distant, each of us is on the land of the traditional owners. And I'm on Wongal land, which is part of the great Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to leaders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people with us today. And I'm really thrilled to be here today, welcoming all of you on behalf of the Australian Gender Equality Council to learn about this groundbreaking report from the University of Queensland and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency on gender equality best practice in the workplace. We'll hear from Dr. Terry Fitzsimmons, the lead researcher and also AGEC's managing director, and also from our esteemed panel who provide their practical, real-world insights on how to make gender equality in the workplace a reality. I'd also like to acknowledge our Zoom webinar host today, Fincia, an important founding member of the Australian Gender Equality Council. Before I hand over to our fabulous moderator for today, Suzi Finkelstein, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Gender Equality Council and why reports like this are so important to what we do. The Australian Gender Equality Council is a national, not-for-profit, non-government organisation established by leading organisations in response to the unacceptably slow pace of change in gender equality in Australia. We launched in 2018 with a major national campaign titled It's Time, and that put a spotlight on the cold hard facts of gender inequality in Australia today. Despite how far we've come since the work of the suffragettes, it's highlighted just how far we have to go before we can achieve gender equality, whether as a measure of the number of women in business leadership or in government, the sustained level of violence against women, pervasive sexual harassment at work, and we've heard a little bit about that in the last few weeks, or the lack of economic security experienced by so many women. And AGEC's mission is to achieve gender equality in Australia. It's as simple and as difficult as that. Through high-profile national awareness campaigns, advocacy and research like this, our goal is to drive a cultural shift in Australia so that men and women have the same rights and opportunities across all sectors of the community. And through our members, we represent over 500,000 Australians. Our members include the National Association of Women in Construction, Australian Women Lawyers, the Rural Women's Coalition, Women in Technology, Engineers Australia, and the list goes on, and they're all committed to gender equality and know we have some way to go. AGEC considered this report on gender equality critical to driving the organisational change we need for gender equality. It's not research for research's sake, but an important evidence-based resource that all organisations should use to ensure their gender equality programs are effective and to make them better. And today we'll also consider the added complexity of COVID-19 and its impacts on gender equality, whether it might accelerate change or what are the risks for gender equality, particularly in the workplace. A couple of things to note before we kick off. Like you, we're all in different locations, so we apologise if things might not be quite as seamless as they might be if in the same room. We do have a business continuity plan, so if one of us drops out, please be patient. If that happens, we'll do our best to keep going and reconnect. Also, please note we are recording the session today, and we'll send you an email with the link after the event for you to access and share. And of course, to guide us artfully through the session, we're really fortunate to have our moderator here today, Suzi Finkelstein. You'll see Suzi's bio up there on the screen. Suzi is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian School of Applied Management and Women Leadership Australia. And I won't read the whole bio, but just to say Suzi has been a senior leadership with the School of Applied Management for over 10 years now, and was most recently Global Executive Director of Women in Leadership Australia, which was also a founding member of AGEC. Suzi has built a powerful reputation for developing leaders, and to date over 60,000 women across the globe have benefited from the Women and Leadership initiative that Suzi has guided and championed. So with that introduction, I'll hand over to you, Suzi, to introduce Terry and moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Victoria. And I as well would like to acknowledge the land that which I'm standing on. So I'm in Melbourne, and I can see already in chat there's quite a few down under as well. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country of the land, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and of course pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Well, thank you, Victoria. Every time I hear that title, I shiver a little bit. It's all very new, CEO. I'm in week 10. So today's session is so important, and particularly lessons from leaders is I'm going to be listening for all those lessons. At Women in Leadership Australia, we really appreciate any opportunity to support AGEC. As Victoria's just said, that we were a founding member, and we actually see AGEC as a roof body to bring in all the amazing work across associations and also industry partners, but most importantly, to support all of us with research and data so that we can all take those steps forward. And that's exactly what today is all about. At Women in Leadership Australia, we work, as Victoria said, with thousands of women across Australia and also New Zealand. And, you know, they do gain from leadership development, from networking support, but there's always a question that comes up, is how do they advocate for change? How do they become the champion for change that, yes, they're very passionate about, and of course the social imperatives there, the moral imperatives, but it's actually backing them up with data so that they can have those conversations. And that's exactly why we're here today, because we need to ensure that we are collating that data but informing everybody so that we can move forward with this as well. And I know after this session we're actually going to be sending you the links and information about that as well. So we're going to have two parts of the session. Firstly, we're actually going to hear directly, hot off the press, from this piece of research. I love this title, The Definitive How-To Guide for Workplace Gender Equality, to understand the research that went behind that as well. And we're going to hear about the impact. We're going to be able to have that synthesis made for us as well. And then to the panel, And I will introduce you to the key people involved in the study as well. So we have Libby Lyons, Workplace Gender Equality Agency Director, Alison Woolsey, the Clayton Utes Director, Diversity Inclusion, and Nigel Davis, Medibank Head of Inclusion, Sustainability and Engagement. But who else to actually start off with in terms of being so close to this research? So I'm delighted to introduce you all to Dr. Terence Fitzsimmons. And as many of you would know, and I'm not going to read the whole bio out, but Terry is a senior lecturer in leadership at the University of Queensland. He's director of the ABE Centre of Gender Equality and Workplace, and also, of course, managing director of AGEC. And as we've heard, it's a body whose members comprise of peak national bodies representing 500,000 women across Australia. And very proud to say that he's also on our advisory board at Women in Leadership Australia as well. His PhD in leadership actually examines successful attributes of CEOs and different pathways for roles for men and women. And I think that really does link really well today. But in February this year, he released a report in partnership with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, which was about examining leading practices in progressing workplace gender equality in Australia. So the report comprised a detailed examination of 120 WGEA Employer of Choice for gender equality firms. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Terry.
Thank you, Suzi. Really great to be here, and it's great to see so many people participating in this. It's amazing. I'm just going to share my screen and then you'll be able to hear me. But I think where this report differs from many is probably its length. It's enormous, but it's enormous because what we've done is something a little bit different in the report, and that is look at the actual day-to-day minutiae of how this is done. So rather than saying you need to do a gender pay audit, or you need to have gender inclusive panels for your recruiting, we've actually gone into exactly how that works. So there are hundreds and hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of things that organisations do, and we've detailed those. And in the early conversations, we decided to go down that track simply because a lot of organisations would genuinely want to do these things, but are not entirely sure how. And so that how-to guide, or that perspective, is where the reports come from. So before I get into some of the insights from the report, what I'd like to do is actually share some of the background of why we went down this track in the first place. And there's some fairly sobering statistics, but I'll try and get through these pretty quickly. It's important because organisations can only do so much. And part of the issue here is that, there's individuals, there's organisations, and there's governments. And each of us have things that we can do. And also there are things that we don't have control over. So I think it's important that we set the scene. So the first point I want to make is it's not a pipeline issue. And the evidence is that women have been graduating in greater numbers from university than men since 1985, arguably 2 generations ago, certainly a lot more than 1 generation ago. And in fact, at the moment, it's close to 60% of our graduates are women. So you might expect, given that 1985 was 35 years ago, and the average age of a CEO is around mid-40s to early 50s, that we should see at least 50% female CEOs. And of course, that's not the case. But the degree that a lot of CEOs undertake along the way, so they have their technical degree, might be an engineering degree, and then they go on to do an MBA usually, to equip them for those executive and CEO roles. And presently, women are graduating at 35% of our graduates from MBA courses, but it's been above 28% for more than a generation as well. So again, you might expect to say, well, if that's the de facto degree to become a CEO, we should see about 28% of our CEOs being women, but again, not the case. So again, in Australia, there should be no reason for this whatsoever, but female graduates, same age, same experience and qualifications, earn 4.8% less than men upon graduation. And the same goes with MBA. 6 years after doing an MBA degree, all things being equal, women earn 20% less than men. So right now, only 5% of our CEOs in our ASX 200 are women, and 8.5% are chairs of those ASX 200 firms. So it's not 60%, it's not 50, it's not 28, it's 5 in the ASX 200. But women do control 6.5% of the market capital in the ASX 200, which tells you that if they are in the 200, they're likely to be in the higher firms in terms of market cap than lower. And the relative number of women CEOs in the ASX 200 has moved significantly forwards, and then actually in the last few years backwards. So there were only 4 female CEOs of ASX 200s in 2002, which has risen to 13 in 2017, and it's down to 10 now in 2020. So we've dropped 3 places. And another really important statistic for Australia, particularly given our mining, energy and construction focus, is that only 14.8% of our engineering graduates last year were women, down from 17% in 2001. So again, we've got a decline in that key STEM field. And only 2/3 of those women graduates actually go on to use those degrees in operational roles, which are likely to progress into executive or CEO roles. So graphically, it's always easier to see these things rather than hear them. Those 3 lines, the green line represents the progress or regress in CEO roles in the ASX 200. The blue line is the chairs, and the orange line are women on boards in ASX 200 firms. Now, you can clearly see something happened in 2009. So there were two things that actually happened in 2009. One was the ASX gender reporting guidelines were introduced, and also the AICD, so the Australian Institute of Company Directors, began their initiatives around women on boards. And you can see quite clearly that when there's an intervention, when organisations get behind this and do the appropriate things, you can see change. The other interesting thing, and I'll kind of use my mouse to circle around the top of that graph, it's an interesting thing about targets. When you get to a target, what happens? So they reach the 30% women on boards and then it flatlines. So you know, maybe we need to rethink our strategies around targets or set them higher or something. But nonetheless, that's an amazing outcome, not reflected down here, unfortunately. So if you project forward on current trend, it's the year 2308 before we get to gender parity in ASX 200 roles for women. And as a MBA student of mine said in one of my lectures, Starfleet, if you're a Star Trek fan, gets set up before that. So with quite some time into the future. Even on general statistics, so using the WGEA data set, you can see at the top there, the rate of progress in women progressing into CEO roles is limited as well. So based on current trend, it's the year 2140 before we get to parity there. But you know, that's obviously better than 2308, but none of us are going to see that either. So there's definitely something going on in CEO roles. It's a different story lower down. Again, if you have a look here in key management personnel right through to other managers, we've got an average 3.8% over 5 years, which means that we should see, if on current trend, parity in at least those roles in the next 30 years. So that's some good news, but it's still considered glacial by most. The other interesting statistic is the gender pay gap. And so if you look at the pay gap over the last 20 years, you can see that since 2004 to now, it's only declined 0.1%. I mean, it's actually 0.09% over that 16 years. So it's gone up. Usually you see it increase. It maps very closely to investment in mining, and the mining booms and busts tend to predict the gender pay gap rise and fall. But if you look across that 10-year period or that 15-year period, we're not performing very well. So a 0.9% drop isn't that flash. And I noticed actually there was an uptick. So it was down to 13.9, I think, in November 2019, and in May it's up to 14, so a slight increase. It'd be very interesting to see once the data's collected for the main impact of COVID, what impact that will have had on the gender pay gap. The other thing that's interesting there is that's average ordinary time earnings, so base pay. But WGEA also collects data on full remuneration. So the base pay can be quite deceptive because the real pay gap in terms of full remuneration tends to be about 5% higher in each state. So the real pay gap at the moment is probably hovering around 19 to 20%. In full remuneration. The other misconception, I think, with the pay gap, certainly not of those in the know, but to most people, when we hear of the pay gap, we think of like for like. Whereas the pay gap data, of course, is made up of the entire Australian economy, and that accounts for the fact that our industries are gender segregated. So men tend to be predominant in industries that are highly paid. That is a big proportion of the pay gap. And of course, men tend to be in the more senior roles, both as CEOs and executives, but also even within banding. So if you're in a university or an organisation that has salary banding, men tend to be at the top of the band and women tend to be at the lower end of the band. And of course, then there is the like for like and the straight discrimination. But these, it's very important to break the pay gap down because firms don't have a terrible amount of control over industry segregation. Children are making their minds up about careers well before they're even contemplating university degrees, let alone where they're going to work. So certainly organisations can do interventions at the lower level, but government and our education system and a whole other range of factors is responsible for this industry segregation. So again, globally, we're not doing particularly well. We've dropped 29 places in the last 15 years. So you can see our sister country, New Zealand, up there in the top 10. It has been there for the last 20 years. as we declined from 15th in 2005 down to 44th in the world. We do well on health outcomes and education, but we do extraordinarily badly in terms of economic participation of women and political representation. And year on year, we just keep getting worse. And it's worse relative to other countries. So you can have a look at some of those countries on the list and you might be quite surprised to see some of those nations that are ahead of us on gender equality metrics. So the big question then is, given that, what can be done? You know, what can organisations do? What can we do as individuals? So, you know, we're coming from a very, very strong base, albeit a century ago. We were the second country behind New Zealand to grant universal suffrage, but we were the first in the world to allow women to stand for national parliament. Yet now we're 49th in the world in terms of that representation. And it always blows the minds of my younger MBA students that there was a time within living memory where women were mandated to receive 25% less in pay in government roles. And that was the case until 1973. In fact, the first act of the Whitlam government was to abolish that mandated pay gap. And yet in Western Australia, in full REM terms, we're still around 26 to 28% pay gap. So work to be done. So that's the background for why this report is important and what can be done about it. And very clearly, things can be done about it. You can see it in terms of women on boards. When organisations get behind it, the right people get behind it, and we institute the right policies and practices, we can have real change. So part of the idea of this was, let's look at the organisations that are doing this well. And WGEA has their Employer of Choice for Gender Equality citation. And the process, I would say, is very, very rigorous, very rigorous. Only genuine organisations that are committed to gender equality can get that citation. And the process by which they do that collects a lot of information, not just statistical, but qualitative. So actual descriptions of what they do, how they do it, when they do it, and particularly why they do it. And so our job was to collect that data over a 5-year period for 120 firms and to say what is right now the details of leading practice. So the good news, of course, is that you can enact change. These organisations have kicked major goals. They've shrunk their pay gaps. There are greater numbers of women in their senior roles. They've got overall greater numbers of women in their organisations. And they've got greater rates of progression compared to non-employer of choice organisations. So what they're doing works. The bad news, I guess, is it's not easy. There's a significant commitment required. There is a cultural shift required, new practices and policies. Governance has to be in place, and the organisation has to be dedicated to a long-term view of the issue. Not that that's bad news, but it means that it's not simple. So in the report, we kind of summarise those 4 areas. They're really, at a basic level, what's required. And of course, there's a lot of work under each of those headings. But in essence, and they interact, you can see the arrows going backwards and forwards there. You have to have an inclusive culture. You either have to create it or sustain that inclusive culture for this to work. You have to have detailed and constantly evolving gender equality practices and learning as you go. And that was, again, a very key feature. No one started this process having all of the answers or even half of the answers. But where these organisations differ is the bravery of including people in devising these policies and then testing them, running them, and then again, having the bravery to admit perhaps we didn't get this entirely right and starting again or tweaking those policies. The other thing is that they all had a holistic strategy. So it wasn't ad hoc. There was a suite of things that are completely connected and work around a single strategic policy around gender equality. There's also very key oversight, not only from board level and executive level, but right through the organisation, and particularly accountability for results. Really important that we actually hold everyone in the organisation accountable from the floor to the boardroom. And I think the 4th thing that we saw there was that reflexivity, that constant engagement with the issue and ongoing learning, and not being so prideful as to go, you know, we've got all of the answers, but certainly seeking those elsewhere. So I just want to quickly go into some of those. We can't go into all of it. Like I said, it's an enormous report. But I think where we've made progress, both commercially in terms of our understanding in the business world, but also academically, is the evidence for the business case. And of course, just recently, Bank West Curtin and WGEA looked at causality, the definitive, is it causal? Having more women in executive roles and in senior leadership roles, is that causal of greater profitability? And I think they've put that debate to rest. I think the answer is a definitive yes. But going back a decade, Deloitte were among the first to actually say, look, it's not just a matter of adding women and stirring. You can't have 60% women, but have them in the lower parts of the organisation and say, oh, we've managed to have gender equality. They said that there needs to be a strategic focus, inclusion, detailed practice around how to get women into all areas of the organisation, so in all the different silos and at all levels of the organisation. And that is not simple. In fact, one of the first things you see in that report is this is extraordinarily difficult. But employers of choice have a genuine belief in the need for gender equality from an equity and a diversity perspective, but also that it makes good business sense. And often you'll hear people, there's a debate about these two cases, an equity and diversity case versus a business case. I think it's kind of redundant. They are, I think, completely linked. The link between them is inclusion and engagement. I mean, simply put, if staff in an organisation have a culture where, doesn't value diversity or drives inequity, then the staff are not going to be engaged. It's as simple as that. And if you don't have engaged staff, you're highly unlikely to be successful or profitable. So the idea of the equity and the diversity case being separate from the business case, it's the equity and diversity case that drives the business case. And I think that's important. And certainly the AGEC organisations recognise that. So I think, not that I want to pick particular items out, but I think flexibility is an absolute key, as is early childhood education and childcare. But flexibility, I think, is paramount. And again, a very key component of all of these organisations is their focus on flexibility. So particularly when, how and where work is performed, and they've all made significant investments in the technology that allows that to happen, job redesign where it's necessary, having sufficient resourcing around HR to support managers in how to create flexible environments and flexible work, but also policies and practices, but that actually serve not just the employee, but the teams that they work in and the organisation as a whole. So again, flexibility is considered across the organisation. It's not just an individual issue, it's an organisational and team issue. So you'll have heard many organisations have adopted the all roles flex mentality. So that is, let's assume that a role can be flexible. That's our starting position. But even if a role can't be made completely flexible, there are certainly elements of it that can be made more flexible. And I think that's a cultural or a way of viewing flexibility that thankfully I think will have been enhanced by, if there is a silver lining to COVID, is that I don't think we can go back to the world that denied the ability to be flexible. Also, a significant and key feature of these organisations is around childcare. So starting with the gender neutrality of parental leave policies, but particularly their flexibility around how parental leave is taken, making sure that people are still included in the organisation even during their absence. So not discontinuing their benefits, but continuing those around long service, around annual leave eligibility, and even the day-to-day things about maintaining their computer or their telephone number, or all of those kinds of things that make people feel included during their absence. And particularly, organisations have gone a long way to locating and accessing childcare options and helping with finding childcare places. All of those things are super important and are a key feature. Also, culturally, these organisations recognise that this divide between work and home has basically completely disappeared. They recognise that. They don't consider the worker to be theirs and then they disappear behind a wall when they leave the building. And in that way, a lot of these organisations have internal family networks, parenting initiatives. They recognise that people are whole. You can't divide them in half between work and home. And that's recognised and supported. And of course, that's part of their culture. The other key part of practice is making sure that every single facet of the employee life cycle is accounted for in terms of gender equality. So from recruitment and selection to onboarding, performance promotion, pay, training, mentoring, all of these things not only have a policy and definitive practices, but they're regularly measured. There's continuous oversight and accountability in each area. And those things are tracked religiously across the organisation. Now, that's not to say there won't be slippages here and there, but they can measure and therefore they can manage each of these parts of the employee life cycle. And in fact, a lot of the report is devoted to those individual practices and how they're measured over time. Another key feature is, and I guess it makes sense, I mean, any business that wants to launch into a new strategy, a new market, a new product, they're going to have a strategic plan to do that. And they're going to have all of the components mapped out. They're going to have everyone on board with it. Gender equality as an initiative shouldn't be any different, certainly as a strategic initiative. And so again, a key feature of employer of choice organisations or leading practice organisations for gender equality is the fact that they had a gender equality strategy. And that strategy plugged directly into their overarching strategy for the organisation. So all of the things that you would expect to see in a strategic initiative, whether it's a new product, a new market, etc., are there for their gender equality strategies. So a detailed plan that fits into the overall organisation's strategy, suites of policies and practices that support that strategy and are linked to that strategy, decision structures right from the board down to employee action groups, and all of those are mapped and connected together. And accountability, and I keep talking about accountability, it is necessary from line managers right up to the CEO to understand what they're responsible for, how they're going to be measured for it, how they're going to be rewarded, or what we do when we don't reach those targets. And again, those organisations have that mapped out completely. So definitive targets and milestones throughout their organisations. And metrics and measures for all of those things. So sometimes dozens, but sometimes hundreds of measures that they can map as they go. And I think while they may not have set out thinking this, but certainly a feature of all of the organisations that are employers of choice have realised that this is a journey. It's not something that you can knock over in a year or even 3 to 5 years. It's a journey that takes a long time. And again, I go back to that Deloitte report, which highlighted that, you know, you're really in for the long term. And so organisations that are leading practice organisations have started to adopt probably pretty early on the idea of change management practices. So continuous learning, always being open to new practices, new insights, going outside the organisation, attending seminars or industry groups that are looking at this issue and sharing ideas. And I think it's a fantastic feature of the employers of choice that they share this material with one another. I was quite surprised because sometimes, you know, organisations want that strategic advantage, and I'm sure they get it, but it's through their culture and their people, not by hiding the practices. And I think that's great. So these organisations seek out and share best practice. They've got, and I keep talking about metrics, but some metrics can be taken annually. You can act on them annually and look at them annually. Most organisations that are employers of choice, do this at least monthly or quarterly. Some, in fact, had live dashboards, collecting data live so that you can see trends in all of the areas of the employee life cycle on a daily basis, which is amazing. The other thing is that they involve everyone in the organisation. So pilots and focus groups involve managers and staff in developing initiatives or even trialling those new policies and practices. So very inclusive. Not afraid to revisit policy and scrap it if it's not working and start again, but certainly constantly evolving and tweaking policy and practice and renewing that strategy regularly. So it's never off the agenda, I guess is what I'm saying. And another key feature with the CEOs and the executives is that they recruit. So often change can derail with a new CEO. These organisations make sure that when they're recruiting inclusive and gender equality minded leaders to the organisation. So just one of the surprises, I guess, or certainly wasn't expected. The diagram there on the left shows on the outer ring, the number of women that are employed full-time, so not casual or part-time, but full-time, in non-employer of choice organisations. The inner ring represents women employed full-time in our EOCGE cohort. And you can see straight away that there are far more women employed full-time. Now that's almost counterintuitive, because we think, oh, well, one of the ways we can have workforce participation of more women is to make the roles part-time or casual. And yet these organisations that are employers of choice have far more women in full-time employment. And there's the secret simply in the way in which flexibility is approached. These organisations, when you have control over how, where and when work is done, that degree of flexibility enables more women to stay full-time employed in the workforce, which then enables greater progression. So I don't think it's a coincidence, but again, it was good to see. So I come back here to what can organisations control and what can't they control. So they certainly can control the degree of flexibility. They can help with childcare, parental leave, discrimination and policy and practice, but they can't actually treat the cause. You know, that dealing with stereotypes and structures, they can help, they can train, but these things are deeply ingrained in childhood, and particularly structures around childcare, etc., that they sit with our educators and with our governments. I think at an individual level, it was really great to see that these organisations have well-developed and sophisticated women's networks. And when I say women's networks, there were men involved in them as well. But the idea is that they were formal, they were listened to, they were also the drivers of change. So they were a catalyst for change, but they were the repository of knowledge about change. So they could act as a source of expert opinion, they could be advocates for what they're hearing elsewhere, be formal and informal mentors for other women in the organisation, sponsors of forums, hubs for inclusion. So if you're in an organisation that doesn't have a women's network, that is something you can do straight away, is speak to like-minded women and men about how we can drive this issue coming forward or going forward. So in concluding, we're emerging slowly from COVID, and if you're in Victoria, obviously that's disturbing and we're going backwards somewhere, but I think we will come out of this at some point in the next 12 months to 18 months. But there is a growing body of evidence that COVID has had a gendered impact and a significant gendered impact. And there's some of the reasons why we think that, and there's more evidence coming out daily. So ironically, at a time when women are having to do more in their workplace, but also at home because of the division of domestic labour, it's also the time where they need to push for their rights. And in essence, I think there's a couple of things. We've seen the government enact the free childcare. I think we need to go a step further. We need to have free universal early childhood education. I never understood the divide between a child being 6 years old and getting primary education, but it being treated differently at a younger age. And I think the other thing we need to look at is addressing what's the cause of this in the first place. And I think we need a national dialogue around gender stereotypes and how all of this gets set up in the first place. But I'll leave it there because I've exceeded my 25 minutes, and I will hand back to Suzi.
Pretty close though, Terry. Thank you so much. There was so much there. And yes, there were lots of questions in chat about will we send the slides out, and definitely you'll have access to that soon as well. So this is a great time to bring our other panel members in. So I'd like to introduce you to Libby Lyons, the Director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And you can see a very impressive bio. Libby has been involved in the role since 2015 and oversees the reporting process that gathers gender equality data from more than 10,000 employers, covering more than 4 million employees. And Libby initiated the development of a strategic plan on maximising the agency's world-leading data set and expanding the reach and impact of gender reporting nationally and internationally. And as you can imagine, that is so important that we're actually starting to be seen as the voice for this as well. I'd also like to introduce you to Alison Woolsey, Director of Diversity Inclusion at Clayton Youths. So Alison is a lawyer, has been instrumental in elevating diversity and inclusion to a strategic priority. And you can see what we've just heard, this is so important. And really driving cultural change. It's delivered results internally, which has been recognised by the broader business community, and Nigel Davis, Medibank Head of Inclusion, Sustainability and Engagement. So Nigel has led the development of Medibank's Family Flex Leave project, as well as the Flex Better approach to flexible working, which has seen, as you can see, more than 70% of employees working flexibly across the organisation. And Medibank has been recognised by WGEA as an employer of choice since 2016 and ranked as the top 10 organisation for gender equality globally as well. So let's have a look at this study firstly, and I'd like to turn to firstly Libby, but I'd also like to let everybody know that chat's working well. It's great. I'm keeping my eye on chat, and also we've got the Q&A. So any questions that you would like to definitely use the Q&A button, and we'll try and get to as many as possible, but possibly we'll be synthesizing those as well. But Libby, first up, we know this is really important data, but why now? And were there any surprises for you when you looked at it?
You're right, Suzi, data is so important, but there's no point in having the data if you don't analyse it and look and get those beautiful gold nuggets in there that Terry and his team have found in terms of the employers of choice. So that's why these sorts of reports that Terry's done and that others have done using our data are so vital. We provide a scorecard every year that tells you know, the private sector in Australia, how they're travelling at a very top level, but the deep dives into the data and subsets of our data are absolutely critical. So that's why it's really important. And, you know, I'd like to again thank Terry and his team for the huge amount of work and diligence they put into this report. It is very important, and it is a very definitive guide in what to do to achieve better gender equality outcomes. Was I surprised? No, I wasn't, because I think these are things that we've always intrinsically known that organisations do. We see it in individual organisations, and Medibank and Clayton do a number of these things that are highlighted in the report. So we have seen them individually, but to actually get the data, all the data for the employers of choice over the long 5-year period, which again was important, that really does provide us with the hard evidence, and we need evidence. We need this evidence to convince those that may need a little more convincing that this is not just the right thing to do, it is actually the smart thing to do. But Terry, I am going to be a little bit naughty and play devil's advocate here with you. I'm going to pick you up on the World Economic Forum table. I think that in Australia we have this obsession, and it must be because we all love footy or something, we have this obsession about comparing ourselves against the rest of the world and other countries and what they do. We love a league table. My concern with a league table, whether it be the World Economic Forum or the OECD or whatever, is that we can't always compare like data sets when we're looking at different countries. In fact, it's like trying to compare an apple with an orange. It's just not possible. I think the other thing that concerns me is that often the methodology that these organisations are using around pulling the data together and the methodology they use to put the table together is often not as transparent as I would like. And one of the other things that we did discover, because we've looked at these things a lot, is that there is one organisation that's actually been looking at data that dates back to 2006 for Australia. So I'm always very keen to concentrate on what we're doing in Australia, to read the data that we have in Australia, and to really concentrate on what we're doing and improve what we can do and share what we're doing with the world, the good stuff. And, you know, for our friends across the ditch, you know, their pay gap does look better than ours. However, New Zealand New Zealand calculate their pay gap in a completely different way to us. They use a different data set to us. So there are all these different factors that we cannot account for to enable us to compare even gender pay gaps from countries. And in fact, the work that we've done tells us really the only place that we can almost compare ourselves to in terms of the calculations that we use is the EU. So the EU uses similar calculation to us in calculating their gender pay gap, but again, their data set is different. So I think the thing to do is concentrate on what we're doing here. We are the country, we are the only country in the world collecting the depth and breadth of data around what is happening in workplaces in gender equality. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on what we know works, what we know drives change. And if we do that, we will continue to see better results. We will continue to see more organisations as joining those of leading practice and becoming employers of choice. So, you know, I am a glass half full person, and I will always focus on the positives. Yes, there are a few negatives and we've got to address them, but we are doing well in Australia, and be proud of what we're doing in Australia. Let's not always beat ourselves around the head about what we're doing.
Thank you, Libby. And there's been lots of talk, lots of chat as well about this concept of gender fatigue. And I think that speaks to it. But Terry, right of response, why do you think it is important for, I mean, we always talk about this number. Is it something that you need, that perhaps we need to put into context, like Libby just said? What can this actually tell us? And I love that focus, Libby, and I think we can use that today, because everybody seems to be asking, what can we do? Is it so bad? If it's like this, you know, it's going to take over 100 years. Terry? Sorry, you're on mute.
Right, sorry about that. Absolutely right. And in fact, when you start, you don't even have to scrape the surface a huge amount to see that there are problems with the data set. But I think what you need to do is create a burning platform. If you use numbers that aren't stark, people go, well, what's the problem? In fact, even yesterday, I can't believe I'm still hearing, didn't we sort this out 50 years ago? Why are we still talking about it? You know, you have to hit people in the face with things before they'll change. So while I would agree that, you know, it's quite opaque, really, the process, the way they put those numbers together, we still need to highlight things like the pay gap being based on full rem, not base salary. You might think, well, what's the difference between 15 and 20%? In some people's minds, 20% is appalling and 15% might be approaching acceptable. I think you need to have the glass half empty people like me to kind of say, hey, this isn't good enough. But look, we have to, and this is, you know, this is the Bible of research, is it must be based on fact. And there are issues, obviously, with the World Economic Forum, and that's why I throw it up amongst a whole bunch of other statistics.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really good to, I think, put it in context as well. I think for different audiences, for different times, we need to have different strategies and different data that we can throw at them as well. There was so much in that report. I'm really keen to hear from Nigel and Alison about, you know, what were the key takeaways? What really stood out? Because it can be overwhelming. It can, there's so much to do. And really interested, Alison, from your perspective, we'll start with you. What did you notice? What was helpful about that as well?
Sure. Thanks, Suzi, and hello, everyone. Look, I think there were so many things in the report, Terry. It's an inspirational list of ideas. And even as an employer of choice, I'm inspired, and I'm really, really grateful for it. And it is quite a tome if you read the full report. And I guess as a more mature employer, it would be fair to say, in terms of the employer of choice experience, it'd be fair to say, for me, one of the takeouts, and you made it the point so nicely just then, around starting to feel comfortable with the fact that it is a continuous journey and it is a long journey, and that you do have to keep going back in and revisiting policies. And I've got countless examples of that at the moment. So I guess it's giving me, for someone at our end in the employer of choice leading practice field, a real sense of comfort that it is a long journey, and you never really get there, so to speak. But I think for an employer of for someone applying for employer of choice citation for the first time, what I really liked about it, Suzi and Terry, is the framework you offered, and you had the slide on it there, the focus on culture, the focus on practice, governance, and even that nice reflexivity underpinning it all. I think that's a really helpful framework because it will align with a whole of business strategy nicely. So it lets you put in all those citation categories and elements into a larger business strategy. And I think it's quite constructive in that sense, your report. I think there's lots of ideas in the report that you can implement, Suzi, straight away. There's a few quick wins in there, and I'd really encourage that because that gives you a little bit of momentum, some confidence, and off you go. But if I was to highlight two, for example, where I think people should really focus, it would be read about the importance of CEO and senior leadership team commitment. And then the second one would be, and I know we might come back to some of this in a later discussion, my second one would be to read a little bit more about targets and really start socialising that concept of targets. Thanks, Suzi.
Thanks, Alison. And I think we'll come back as well to that concept of culture as well that you mentioned, because there's been quite a few questions about how, that's a big piece in terms of shifting culture. So, Nigel.
Yeah, hi everyone. Look, I think it's a great resource, the research that Terry's pulled together, and also I think how lucky are we in Australia to have such a depth of data that's provided by Libby and the team at WGEA as well, which puts us in such a fantastic position to be able to understand our progress. I think in terms of the standout messages for me, gender equality, like Terry has discussed, it doesn't happen by some sort of happy accident. So even in organisations like mine, where we have a majoritively female workforce, we really need to take a step back and take a look at a lot of the sort of structures and systems that exist in our organisation and put a microscope over them with a gender equality lens. And it goes to the points that Terry was talking about around the employee life cycle. So when we look at the systems around recruitment in our organisation, are we making sure that women are represented on shortlists and mandating that? Are we actually being really bold around our gender pay equity approaches? And what are our approaches around talent identification and leadership programs as well? If there's not 50% of women sitting on those lists, we need to go back and find more women because we're clearly not looking hard enough. I think the other point that was in the report that Terry spoke to as well is it's okay for us to admit that we don't have all the answers. For too long, I think people in culture or HR or even C-suite executives will come at this from a top-down approach and think that they've got all the answers, and we just don't. So at Medibank, we are really deliberate about how we leverage our gender equality network and make sure that we're designing our policies and our approaches to really fit the needs of our business and of our people. So we work really closely with that network of women and men from across the organisation. And we use human-centred design approaches to understand what are the actual issues that are impacting. And that was probably one of the things that was key. So for example, when we redesigned our approach to parental leave, we thought we'd get all sorts of comments around, paying super on parental leave and those sorts of bits and pieces, or even just having access to more leave. Whereas in fact, it was just around the availability of flexibility and choice in how they use that leave. And we probably wouldn't have come to that without that research.
That's great, thank you. And
comment, Suzi, here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I think a couple of the takeouts from this report and also from other work that we've done at the agency is there are a couple of things that really make a difference here. The first is access to parental leave for all, and that's paid parental leave. And there was another study we did that showed that if you actually provide 13 plus weeks of paid parental leave, you are far more likely to retain that person in the organisation. And we waste something like $364 million a year in recruitment costs, unnecessary recruitment costs in Australia every year. So access to paid parental leave for parents, not for women, not for men, for parents. We're all parents. That's really important. The second thing is flexible work, normalising it. that flexible work becomes normal for women and men. And if we think that for every hour of unpaid care and domestic work that men do in Australia today, women are doing an hour and 46 minutes, that normalisation of flexible work is terribly important, because the only way we are going to even that disproportionate amount of unpaid care and work that women are doing is through men being able to work flexibly. The other thing that we know, and I think came out in spades in Terry's report and in others that we've done, is you've got to have a plan, but you've got to take action. You must have an action plan. And when you have an action plan in place, you must make people accountable for ensuring those actions take place, that ensuring you meet targets, ensuring that you have 50% women and men on your interview panel for your recruitment, making sure that people are accountable in ensuring that training happens around sex-based harassment in the workplace, and all of those different things that you put in place. Making people accountable is essential. So yes, you've got to have the commitment from above, but you also need to get commitment from those beneath you through making them accountable and giving them the power and the control to make decisions and make the right decisions to ensure that you meet your targets in that action plan.
Thank you, some great points there. And that really points to as well, and we're going to circle around and bring this back at the end of the session today, because I'm really hoping that people will leave with some really practical strategies or an insight commitment for themselves that we can all gain from. But I'm really keen to hear from you all. What's something you can do for yourself? So we've got people in all levels of organisations. Some people are saying they're frustrated because they haven't got that influence above them. And great point, Libby, that you can influence people around you. But in terms of what can people do individually as leaders, what's something that you would suggest? Alison, lots of nodding there.
Look, I think as a leader, and probably more for a senior person, but indeed everyone, is to educate yourself. And by that I mean go out there and do a little bit of reading. Read what the academics, the Terrys of the world are saying. Read what the consultancy houses are saying. Read what the D&I practitioners are saying. And there's some real seminal pieces out there which will really fill you in on the bigger picture. And then I think you need to find a real safe space as well to talk about some of those things, because some of what you read might be challenging and you question it, and you've got the gendered norms and stereotypes in your head, and so you just need a safe person to talk to about that with. So you need to do that. I think as a D&I practitioner, that's something where I can be helpful in that sort of endeavour. And I give the example and it came up in Terry's point around continuity. We actually have a new chief executive who just started. So he started in the middle of May. And I spent some time with him, as it happens, last week, taking him through the WGEA Employer of Choice citation, explaining what it was. Now, to be fair, he had a fair idea and he'd had some exposure before. But it was a really helpful exercise, just investing 45 minutes, talking him through the expectations of a chief executive, but you could do it with your senior leadership team as well, the expectations of him under the citation, and digressing, going off on a few tangents, and him, I guess, really starting to own it and see him approach it, I guess, like a business issue, see him want to tackle it. And I found that incredibly heartening. And I think for people like him and for other leaders, it's really important to talk to others. And if you are in a mentoring relationship, particularly with perhaps a young female, and I say that in the context of a law firm, we really encourage this reverse mentoring concept. So we've got young female lawyers talking to senior leaders in the firm and just sharing their experience in that reverse fashion. That tends to work really, really well. The other point, Suzi, I'd really like to make for leaders is if you've got an opportunity, play to your strength. And that might be your personal strength, or it might be the strength of the organisation. And I give the example for us where we're a firm that's really quite passionate about LGBTIQ inclusion. And we've really come a long way in the last 5 years on that. But what we started doing in the last couple of years is focusing in particular on LGBTIQ women. And that's given us an avenue to talk about gender equality. In that context, it's a little bit more incremental, and we've got buy-in from the LGBTIQ men, we've got buy-in from the LGBTIQ allies, and so all of a sudden we're talking about essentially gender equality issues, but in a different guise. And as a bit of a side note, one thing that we've discovered is that when we go on campus and talk to university students, if we fly the LGBTIQ inclusion flag, the women on campus see that as a signal that we're a progressive gender equality firm. So a really nice, I guess, fallout from another program, and that's been really, really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And there's been some comments as well about, is it helpful taking gender out? Are we looking at more, across different forms? So I think you've answered that in some way as well. Nigel, what do you see?
Yeah, I think from my perspective as leaders, I think it's just kind of really time for leaders to accept that they need to have some skin in the game here. So at an individual level, and for a lot of the people on this call today, I would suggest get involved and be the squeaky wheel. There's plenty of opportunities to engage with leaders from across the business who might be more senior than you, or with your HR departments, to identify what the issues are, but also come to them with solutions or just a willingness to act on them. I also think from a senior leadership level as well, Terry's data was quite stark in that it was saying like CEO parity, for example, by 2308. That's ridiculous. And really what we need to do is to make sure that leaders from across organisations are taking the time to actively nurture female talent. So roles on boards, roles in senior leadership teams, they don't change hands very often. So we need to be aware of where the talent exists in our organisation and being really broad when we're thinking about what is talent and thinking differently around how we recruit those roles. We need to be really intentional around how we support and develop women so that when those opportunities do arise, we've got a long list of viable female candidates that we can just throw into those conversations, and also feel really strong about our ability to challenge some of those discussions as well.
There's some great comments coming up, Nigel, and it comes with risk, speaking up, being that squeaky wheel. And the other question that we hear all the time from our participants is, how do we get men on board? And there are men here today, I don't know the numbers, but I know that there's been a real focus on trying to get men part of this conversation. But everybody here probably is an advocate and champion already. How do you get others to speak up with, and that risk question as well, because it can actually be quite career defining?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think psychological safety is a big component. There will always be allies in your organisation. It's about finding out who those allies are and working with them and their networks to influence change. So it may not be direct, but there are other paths and avenues rather than, I guess, putting yourself at risk. I think in regards to getting men on board, this is where visible leadership from senior men in the organisation is absolutely going to be key. So if we think about not being able to be what you can't see, the more we can see senior leaders, especially CEOs, working flexibly, taking time out to care for children, taking time out to care for elderly parents. We're increasingly seeing that this is an issue, so broader care outside just childcare. We need men to stand up and lean into that space and be really visible when they're doing it as well. And that creates that sense of permission for others in the organisation to start to do those things as well.
Thank you. And I think this is a really great point. Rachel, can we have the second polling question up? Because this question is actually going to ask from everybody in this session to actually identify what you think has the most impact on gender equality in the workplace. So it's on your screen now. And while that's coming up, so if you can just choose one of those options, and so we can see, what do you think is actually going to make the most difference? And while that is coming up, Libby, what do you think? What would you be voting on that list?
I think for me, early childhood education is a huge barrier to women entering the workforce, re-entering the workforce. And I think that we actually need to look at structural change. I think that, you know, if childcare is very variable at the moment. When it's provided by the private sector, it is variable. I think we need, as I say, structural change so that we can regulate the care, so that we can have a curriculum that is agreed by people. And I think I believe, and this is a personal view, but I think similarly to Terry, I believe that we have a fabulous infrastructure in place in terms of primary education. We should be expanding that and providing optional early childhood education from the age of 2. And we know that early childhood education is terribly important in the development of our children and the way that they develop and grow up. But at the moment, the value that we place on that early childhood education and the people who provide it is terribly low. In Australia today, you need basically the same educational attainment to be a car mechanic as you do to be an early childhood educator. And yet, on average, car mechanics earn twice that of early childhood educators. How have we got this so wrong? How have we got to 2020 and we have this so wrong that we value our cars more than we value our children? So I think it is absolutely time to have that national discussion about structural change. And I think that if the minute that all families, and this is not about women and men, this is about providing families with affordable early childhood education. And once we have that, then women and men, as either as individuals or as families or however they may live, then have true choice about how they want to engage in the workforce, if they want to engage in the workforce. And this is about choice. Not everybody wants to work. A lot of people want to stay home with their children, and that's absolutely fine. It's about choice. But we need the discussion around that structural change.
Which then points us to another question, Terry. How do we? There's been some questions in the chat about this is actually an issue that we need to get our governments to focus, and there are lots of issues that we want them to focus on. And the questions are coming through is, how do we do that? How do we lift this so that it actually starts getting the attention it needs?
I think, so the studies that look at, I'm going to go high and then come down low, but in terms of GDP, this is a no-brainer. So anecdotally, there's McDonald's Australia, I think now we're talking 15 years ago at North Ryde, set up a daycare centre. So we're not talking early childhood education, we're just talking about daycare. And there was a huge debate at the time about the cost of doing that. Now, I was involved with them about 2 years after they'd set that thing up, and they'd already done all of the reviews on it. And the view looking back was, we got a 7 times return on our investment in terms of staff engagement, extra hours, the kids, and they also had policies about kids coming up into the office and how it created a family environment. But they were astounded at the multiple of the return to their organisation. Now that's a micro level, but McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, World Economic Forum, they've all done studies around engagement and having more women in the workforce, equally distributed across sectors, further up in the hierarchy. And you're talking 10 to 20% increase in GDP. I can't think of a single initiative that would even come close to producing that kind of an economic return for a country. And yet we're not even talking about it. To have, you know, our early, and I agree with Libby, it is absolutely disgusting that some of our most highly treasured people in terms of what they do, how they do it for our kids, are some of the most poorly paid people in this country. And it was actually, I noticed Coral's here. She's on our board at AGEC, talking about just how difficult it was by making childcare free during the COVID pandemic, how it impacted differentially on councils, private sector organisations, different bodies. This mess that we have in the way in which we're rolling this out means that unfortunately, a government, whether it's Labor or Liberal, someone's going to have to be extraordinarily brave to admit the failure and to wipe the slate clean and say, listen, we have a structure around our primary education system. It works, it's good. Perhaps we need to consult with each of the states and do something similar in terms of recognising that these early childhood educators are teachers just as much as our primary and our secondary teachers are. And we need a system like we have for primary education. And, you know, we shouldn't actually create this artificial divide between ages 5 and 6. So I know I've probably wandered all over the place with that answer, but as a national imperative, if it was one thing we could do to drive gender equality, but also our economy, it goes hand in hand, but that's one thing we could do.
Yeah, and I can see Alicia Heath is here as well. So I think Women for Election is so important. You know, we need to have that representation to get the voice there as well. Do we have results to that poll? Does that, okay, see? Yeah. Interestingly, you know, where it's confirming what we're talking about today, and it doesn't always, it doesn't have to, so it's great to have those results. Thank you. We need to talk about today, though. We need to talk about COVID. It's come up slightly, and I'm really keen to hear, what do you think, you know, we've been hearing that there's been a negative impact, that it's had a gendered impact, COVID. And I'd like to, we're going to put another polling question out there as well, about really identifying what you're noticing around you as well. Are you seeing that? But Alison and Nigel, it'd be great to hear from you as well on this. What are you noticing? Any surprises, any good news, or some harsh realities as well?
I'm still probably sitting a little bit on the fence. Because I think it really is still playing out. And just before we came on the call today, we were talking about how our Melbourne office is obviously still fairly locked down compared to our Perth office, which opened, I think, nearly a month ago, and albeit not to full capacity, but we're experiencing really different levels of returning to the office. And so I think we're going to have different experiences in those two offices in terms of the flexible working experience. So like I say, I think the story's still got to play out. But I would argue at the end of the day, I think that from a professional services firm perspective, that it's good news. And the reason I say that is it is an intervention. It is a great intervention in terms of shifting the dial on parenting responsibility and flexible working. And all of a sudden the playing field in the professional space, and I'm talking particularly about our lawyers, we've seen a levelling of the playing field. And I'm hoping this will permanently change how we view flexible working, and that we'll get a lot more men wanting to continue it. And already our return to office surveys are suggesting a huge number of both men and women will want to work on a flexible basis going forward. And I think we'll see more men agitate as a result also for improved paid parental leave policy, and that gets me really excited. I think that's a great concept. So in effect, what's going to be good for men is going to be good for our women.
Absolutely. And I was recently working with a big government department, and they said that they had the process stepped out. It was going to take them 18 months to bring in a flexible policy, and it took, 3 days? So there's something about a crisis that creates clarity, and I think that's what we want to actually gain in terms of process. So Nigel, what have you noticed? What's some good news, and perhaps anything that we need to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think there's potentially risks, but also opportunities that this whole COVID situation has presented. I think we know at the macroeconomic level that women have been disproportionately impacted by this crisis, and I think as we start to work our way out of the recession, we're already hearing about, shovel-ready projects that are in male-dominated industries that are going to receive, economic stimulus, whereas things like free childcare, for example, are going back on the back burner. I think one of the other things we need to be careful of as we start to transition back to our offices, and our offices being, our traditional centres of power, if men start to return to those offices at disproportionate levels to women, that will have a real change to this, to I guess the ways that we're working, and I guess some of those biases creeping back into our old ways of thinking. But I think there's also opportunities as well. So we've all been thrown into this chaotic environment where we're working from home. We've got family members that we need to take care of. We've got dogs that need to be walked. We've got messy backgrounds going on, people walking in the background of Zoom meetings. How do we take that and run with it and make sure that we keep that alive as we move back into the new sort of normal? So I would hate for the messiness of life, or the child caring stuff, the parenting stuff, to just become taboo and unspoken about again. We're seeing more of our people than we ever have before, and we really need to hold on to that as we move forward.
Thank you. And I think we are hearing some very sobering initiatives that are coming through, but I was working with a woman last week, and she was told, government department as well, that if she didn't come back to work full-time in the office, it would actually have a negative impact on her career opportunities. So I think it's not all, we have to keep an eye on this. It's not all good news, and that's really important as well. Circling back to that survey before, Libby, it came up that everybody is aware about CEO, sorry, not that one, the first one, the CEO, that leadership at the top. And I know that today is also about celebrating more data that many of us have been able to read because of the great work that WGEA and Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre has done. It'd be great to hear from you. I mean, no surprises, I'm sure, but what do you think the takeout of that piece is that we can all go away and utilise?
I think the important thing about the report that we released a week or so ago with Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre is that for the first time that we can ascertain, we now have a causal link between increasing the share of women in leadership and productivity, profitability, and the other P, which I can't think of at the moment. So for the first time ever, we found this causal relationship, this causal link. And, you know, that's incredible. And that comes as a result of having longitudinal data. So one of the things that was discovered through this was Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, again, took a subset of the WGEA data set, and they took the subset, which are those ASX listed companies. And they found that having a female CEO leads to a 5% increase in the market value of Australian listed ASX companies, which equates to roughly $80 million for the average company. So, and that's from the data. And that's, as I say, the first causal link. It found that if you, an increase in 10 percentage points or more in female representation on boards of Australian ASX listed companies leads to a 4.9% increase in company market value, or the equivalent, which equates to about $78.5 million for the average company. And an increase of 10 percentage points or more in the share of female key personnel, so generally that level under CEO, leads to a 6.6% increase in market value of an ASX listed company, which equates to about $105 million for the average ASX company. So this is the first time we found this causal link. So, you know, there've been lots of other studies that have said that, you know, we think this happens, but this is the first time we've had this causal link. I mean, you know, the jury's in on this. The jury's in on this. The business case now has been, you know, absolutely proven. And I believe that as board directors and that as executives of organisations, we all have fiduciary duties to our owners and shareholders to ensure that we are doing everything that we can to maximise market value, to maximise productivity of our organisations. So if they are ignoring this report and ignoring this hard evidence, they are not meeting those fiduciary duties. So it's a very, very clear message from this report. So it's pretty exciting. A link to it is on our website. And as I say, you know, at a time when we are moving into a period of economic recovery, this absolutely proves that you must continue with your diversity and inclusion and gender equality strategies. It will be key to your success, and ensuring that you have more women, particularly in leadership roles, will ensure that you actually outperform your competitors. So it's, you know, the data's there, the evidence is there, just do it.
Thank you. I think we've heard. And I think that's pretty clear, and it's great to actually know that we've got those numbers available as well. Can we see the data, the poll that we just did around COVID? So a lot of people not quite sure to know what that looks like, but we are seeing that, yeah, that it's slight peak on worsened. So I think that's probably a good point for us to all to come back and actually think about. What do you want us to leave with today? What's important in terms of here we are now in some states, we're definitely not in the next phase, we're still in the first phase, but some states across Australia are actually re-entering. What do you think we need to keep an eye out for? So, because there's been lots of great things that we've learnt from this, but also we need to keep an eye out in terms of that negative gendered impact. Alison?
One thing for me would be that you need to go back and look at your policies, and you need to make sure that they're responding to this new world order. And I think the flexibility policy is a great place to start. We actually coincidentally launched a new policy just before Christmas, which is principles-based rather than a prescriptive flexibility policy. And a principles-based policy has allowed us to respond quite well to the crisis. And the reason that's relevant is it gives leaders a real anchor. It gives them confidence if there's a policy that is responding to the situation, and it gives them confidence that their interest is, they're protected, the interests of their clients are protected, the interests of an individual are protected. And so going back to some basics like that has been a really useful initiative for us. I think you've got to really leverage the fact we've got this online platform for everything at the moment. And you've got to use it to accelerate some actions. And that might be, I was just reflecting on this yesterday in the context of how we can enhance our parental leave experience. We're online now for everything. So why can't we tap into some of our men or women who are on parental leave and pull them into a few more meetings, events, activity, which ordinarily, you know, you'd have to bring them in and book a car park, and it becomes a bit more of an experience, whereas this could be a lot more spontaneous. Little things like that, use the platform. Nigel touched on it or mentioned it very nicely, this unconscious bias awareness. We were always on notice for women in the context of all the talent touch points, recruitment, promotion, REM reviews, etc. But it's amplified in times of stress and anxiety. And so we're trying to work with our leaders and our HR team to really articulate where else it's going to crop up. And it's going to crop up in a video conference scenario. It's going to crop up with a work allocation when some are in the office, some are at home. That hybrid arrangement is just going to throw up all sorts of new issues. And as good as it sounds, it's, you know, there's some difficult issues ahead. And I think Terry makes the point about, and I made it before too, about just you've got to keep reflecting. And I think I find myself during COVID-19 taking a step back from our D&I strategy, and particularly a gender equality strategy, and really looking at what can be done better.
And it's a great time to be stepping back when we're forced to do that as well. But really sage points there. Nigel? Sorry, you're on mute.
That's right. Yeah, look, I would probably disagree with what Alison said. I think, I mean, for me, unconscious bias, the jury for me is still a little bit out on unconscious bias, because I think once people go through the training and they're made aware of it, they're like, oh, okay, so that bias doesn't exist for me anymore. So, but I do think it provides a really useful paradigm. We're in a crisis situation here, and when we're in a crisis situation, we think really quickly, we revert back to old ways of thinking. we tend to be a lot more guarded around what we're doing and a lot more risk averse. So just making sure that we're continuing to be mindful as we make decisions, and really putting that gender lens over the decisions that we're making. So when we're looking at transition plans back to the office, have we applied a gender lens over that? When we're looking at restructuring or redeployment of our workforce, have we put a gender lens over that? I think there's also a really fantastic opportunity here to provide women with a once in a career opportunity to help lead businesses out of a crisis. It's such a great opportunity to let our female talent get involved in something that is really going to make them stand out for the crowd when it comes to going for those C-suite roles or those CEO roles. I think also it's just really important that we don't waste what we've learned through this as well. It's been a really good opportunity for us to kind of pause and for individuals to consider what's their purpose, and really, rather than us rushing back into the way things were, let's kind of just slow things down a little bit and think through the impacts in a more mindful way.
Thank you. And we've just got one more minute. Terry, what's one thing in terms of AGEC? What do we need to keep an eye out? What can we hope from AGEC to take us forward? And you're on mute.
There we go. Look, I want to hark back to the study that we did before this one, which was the Hands Up for Gender Equality with our kids, where we surveyed 10,000 of our highest matriculating boys and girls. And it just highlights the absolutely all-pervasive problem we have with stereotypes that just generates this generation after generation. What we can all do as aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, is role model what we're talking about. Sharing equally in the indoor-outdoor tasks, sharing equally in care, getting rid of this division of domestic labour in the home so that kids can see what the real world should look like. They get bombarded with it on TV, they get bombarded with it in school and what friends are saying, and it just goes on generation after generation. And it drives pretty much everything we see. So from bias through to career selection, through to gendered pocket money. It's just incredible. So my takeaway would be, sure, the workplace is important, but this starts well before the workplace, and we're all citizens. We're all relatives to a child somewhere, even if it's just a favourite aunt or uncle that isn't related. Let's start demonstrating this stuff.
Which takes us to that last point. If you could all get on chat now, I'm talking to over 346 people. Tell us what's one thing that you're committing to, that you're going to. There's been some questions, can they save chat? Victoria, they can, so they will get a copy of chat as well. Look, on behalf of the panel, I thank you so much. I've learned so much. There's so much passion. There's so many insights and also practical solutions. And I think we're all part of this now. And I think there's nothing like a crisis that can create some clarity. And we're certainly in that as well. Thanks, everybody. And I'll hand over to Victoria.
And thanks so much, Suzi. And thanks for the panel for your really frank and insightful remarks. And some of the takeaways for me, particularly around the skin in the game, both not just skin in the game for leadership and CEOs, but how do we include everyone in the organisation to really help find the solutions for the organisation. The squeaky wheel, it's not always easy. I find sometimes if it's a question squeaky wheel, not a statement, it's often helpful, but also making safe space for everyone to have the conversations, ask some of the hard questions, normalising flex and parental leave for everybody. There's a whole range of things. And so as we said, this, and as the report indicates, it's not a simple one thing to do, and it will differ for every organisation. And as I expected, the time today went incredibly quickly, and we really just scratched the surface on some of the issues and insights that are in the report, but also some of those broader issues around gender equality, and they certainly came up a lot in the chat. A consistent theme from the report and the panel, though, is achieving that gender equality really requires focus and effort, long-term commitment from the top down, and it may not be easy or straightforward, but it is clear that it can be done, and the rewards are significant for everyone. And early on in the chat, we heard about gender fatigue. I talk about this as a marathon we have to treat like a sprint. So you need to set up your program to know that you're not going to solve this in 6 to 12 months. and you need to build that resilience, and I think we're all getting better at that for other reasons, build that resilience to recognise it's going to take a while to keep getting through and including everyone, but it is worth the effort, and that's really what's important. So I'd like to echo Suzi's call to action today. What are you going to do to continue to champion gender equality? And put something in the chat box, but it's whether as an individual, with people you know, colleagues, friends, whether it's as an individual in an organisation, and however large or small that action is, it actually all makes a difference and is worth it. I really encourage you to read the report, consider the recommendations and how your organisation measures up. Share it with your colleagues and your leaders and ask the question. Use it to start that conversation. It is available on our website, www.agec.org.au, and we will send it out along with the Bankwest report as well in an email and the link to recording today. But I'd also like to encourage you to explore other resources that we have on the AGEC website. Let us know how we can support you in achieving gender equality and how you might be able to help the work of AGEC. And I'm really, really pleased that Terry mentioned the Hands Up for Gender Equality report, because that's another really important example of the tools that will help inform the change that needs to occur. And as I said in my opening, the Australian Gender Equality Council is a not-for-profit, non-government organisation, and we're entirely run by volunteers. So we'd also like you to consider becoming an annual subscriber to AGEC for just $60 a year, or by making a donation, or by asking your organisation to sponsor one of our projects. And I saw really good ideas in the chat about the things that AGEC can champion in the future around gender equality and where to focus our efforts, and we'll certainly take that on board, but we need everyone's support and help. So let me close by expressing my deep appreciation to our speakers today. Terry Fitzsimmons, not only for his fantastic presentation, but his work on the study and ongoing work for AGEC. Libby Lyons, Director of WGEA, who made the study possible, and as you heard today, a tireless campaigner for gender equality. And also thanks to Alison Woolsey from Clayton and Nigel Davis from Medibank for being with us today. Their participation in the study and employer of choice, but also their leadership and insights on gender equality and how to make it work. Extra special thanks to Suzi for being a great moderator today. And there were an enormous number of questions that you managed to pull together, so thank you for that. And also being a leader in her own right on gender equality, and to Women Leadership Australia as an important member of AGEC and an active supporter in all the things that we do. Thank you again to Fincia, and in particular Rachel Corby, who managed everything for the event behind the scenes. It really does help us to deliver a successful event. And finally, thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please help us continue the work on gender equality. It is worth it. Let it not end here, and it is time. So good afternoon and have a great day. Thanks.